One day in the fall of 1928, Alexander Fleming returns to his lab after a pleasant summer vacation to find that a mysterious mold had contaminated his petri dishes. And this mold was eradicating the bacteria colonies he'd been working to grow. Now, a lot of people would have just thrown the whole thing out and started over. But Fleming did something different. He decided to study the mold. And that's how, way back in 1928, Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin. It's an amazing story. Maybe some of you have heard it before. Raise your hand if you have. It's quite a few. It's one of those stories that's told and retold because it encapsulates so much of what we love about innovation. The idea that a single person with a big idea can truly change the world. Unfortunately, that's not really true. Innovation never happens that way. Not generally, and certainly not in this specific case. So let's look at what really happened. What really happened was, when Alexander Fleming published his findings, nobody really noticed. And nobody really noticed because what Alexander Fleming had discovered was mostly useless. It was just a secretion from a particular mold that could kill bacteria in a petri dish. The compound wasn't stable, so you couldn't store it. You couldn't inject it. You certainly wouldn't want to ingest it. And you couldn't make nearly enough of it to be at all therapeutically effective. So much like thousands of papers published that very same year, Alexander Fleming's discovery lay hidden in a scientific journal. And it stayed that way for 10 years until it was rediscovered by a completely different group of scientists headed up by Howard Florey and Ernst Chain. Now, Florey was a pathologist, much like Fleming was, but there was an important difference between them. While Fleming largely worked alone, Florey headed up a pretty decent-sized lab, and that meant that he had access to a much more diverse set of skills. For instance, Chain was a world-class biochemist, exactly the type of guy you'd need to transform that mold juice into a storable powder. There was also another guy in the lab, a guy named Norman Heatley, and he was like a whiz at putting together apparatus from little nicks and knacks he found around the lab. And he developed a fermentation process for penicillin. Now, this was really important because it allowed them to make enough of this stuff that they could start testing it on mice. And because this was a fairly decent-sized lab, they had the technicians and the facilities in order to do that. So they took about 50 mice. They injected all of them with a lethal dose of Streptococcus bacteria. Half got treated with penicillin, the other half was a control group. After 16 hours, every single one of the mice in the control group had died. But after 10 days, 24 out of the 25 that had been treated with penicillin were in perfect health. And as it turned out, the 25th one had died of a completely different cause. Now, this was an astounding result, because back then, there was no effective treatment for bacterial infections. Think about that. You could get even a minor scratch, and if it got infected, you could die from it. In fact, that's exactly what happened to a policeman named Albert Alexander. he had been working in his garden. He got a little scratch on his face from a rose bush. It got infected, and next thing you know, he's in a septic ward at death's door. And that's where Florian Chain found him. And he became the first human to be treated with penicillin. And his condition immediately started to improve. But then there was a glitch. They ran out of penicillin. And even with Heatley's fermentation process, they couldn't make it fast enough to continue the treatment, and the patient died. So obviously there was more work to do. But they had another problem as well. This was 1941. They were in England. England was at war. And it was hard enough to scrounge up the resources to continue the research, much less scale it up. Luckily, though, Fleury had done a Rhodes Scholarship in the United States. And over the years, he had worked to maintain many of those relationships. And it was through those relationships he was able to get a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation to travel to America. And the circle widened further. Working with several American labs, they were able to find a much more powerful strain of the penicillin mold. And they were also able to find a much, much stronger fermentation medium called corn steep liquor. Very common in the American Midwest at the time, but absolutely unheard of back in England. The progress became so encouraging that the US military made penicillin its second highest research priority, just after the Manhattan Project that led to the first atomic bomb. And the War Board basically ordered 24 pharmaceutical companies to start figuring out how to make it in bulk. 1944, penicillin was first deployed during the D-Day invasion. But even then, a lot of doctors didn't want to use it. It wasn't like they hadn't been treating bacterial infections. They had, not particularly effectively, but they'd seen some people get better. And they didn't want to risk their patients' lives on some newfangled penicillin that they never heard of and didn't know anything about. Luckily, this was the Army, and they were ordered to use it. And tens of thousands of lives were saved because of it. 1945, penicillin finally becomes commercially available. Now think about that. Think about how different that is from the story we normally hear. It wasn't just one guy, one eureka moment. It took almost 20 years, involved the work of several labs, hundreds, if not thousands of people were involved. Once you take into account production and logistics and all the other problems you need to solve to go from milliliters in a lab to metric tons in the real world. And that's not the exception. That's the rule. Innovation is never a single event. It's a process of discovery, engineering, and transformation. And those things almost never happen in the same time, in the same place, or with the same people. And that's why it takes a while. How long does it take? Usually about 30 years. On average, it takes about 30 years to go from an initial discovery to a significant impact in the real world. Don't get me wrong, I mean, that's not like a natural or physical law. It's more like a rule of thumb. But we're talking decades, not years, and certainly not months. But we rarely hear that. Doesn't make such a nice story. What we'd like to hear is that Steve Jobs, the boy genius, invented the personal computer and drove the computing revolution all by himself. But we know that's not really true. In fact, we can trace the origins of personal computers way back to 1968. Douglas Engelbart and what's now called the mother of all demos. You see, computers back then were much different than they are now. They weren't nice little boxes you could put on your desk, and they certainly weren't sleek little devices that you could fit in your pocket. They were enormous machines. They took up entire rooms. They were only used by a select priesthood that were conversant in the arcane languages you needed to make the things work. And the use cases were just as obscure. Backroom functions in large enterprises, complex scientific calculations. They weren't the type of things that normal people had any real use for. And you didn't interact with computers the way you did today. You inputted data, usually on a stack of punch cards, and then you would get the output sometime later. But Engelbart saw how it could be different. He envisioned a new professional class that he called professional workers who would interact with computers and use them in their work every day. So he stood in front of an auditorium, not unlike this one, and in front of a 20-foot-high screen, and he had a keyboard, and he started to type up a document. And words appeared on the screen. And he had a funny little device he called a mouse that he used to manipulate objects on the screen. So he could edit the document, cutting and pasting, and he was able to insert graphics and sound. This is all commonplace today, but back then, nobody had ever seen anything remotely like it before. Unfortunately, though, much like Fleming, what Engelbart showed them that day was mostly useless. It took 50 technicians to make the thing work, so it's not what you'd call like a practical solution. Nevertheless, 5 years later, disciples of Engelbart had built a working prototype at Xerox PARC. It was called the Alto. So by 1973, the engineering phase had already begun in earnest. But the transformation phase was still a long way off. In fact, when they first showed off the Alto, 4 years later in 1977 at a Xerox Global Conference, all the big shot executives walking around the pavilion, they didn't see what the big deal was. They looked at the Alto, and all they saw was a very expensive device to automate secretarial work. And they already had secretaries to do their secretarial work. If someone had shown them a spreadsheet program, they'd probably have said, oh, that's for the accountants. You know, I'm a big shot executive. My job is to make real decisions. They just didn't see how a personal computer would be relevant to them and helpful in their work. And that was the true genius of Steve Jobs. He saw that middle-class kids would want personal computers just because they were cool. And middle-class parents would be happy to plunk down $2,500 to give their kid a leg up in that computer age they'd been hearing about. Unfortunately, though, a bunch of kids writing term papers and playing video games doesn't create much of an impact. That wouldn't happen until much later. In fact, it wasn't until the mid to late 90s, or almost exactly 30 years from Douglas Engelbart's mother of all demos, that we began to see a measurable impact on productivity. As it turns out, maybe those big shot executives at Xerox, maybe they were actually onto something. Until the mid to late 90s, personal computers really were mostly expensive devices that automated secretarial work and for playing video games. To understand why, let's look at the technology stack. At the base, you have fundamental technologies, like computer chips and operating software. One level up, we have devices, like a Macintosh, or an iPhone, or a server, or a mainframe. But it's not until we get to the application layer that technology actually becomes useful. And to make a useful application, you need people who really understand the technology to learn how to collaborate effectively with people who really understand problems that need to be solved in the real world. And that's not a technology problem. That's a very human problem. And we don't have any fancy algorithms to solve a human problem. We need to solve those all by ourselves. And that's why it takes 30 years. You know, a lot of people, they hear about the 30 years rule and they get discouraged. They say, 30 years? I'll probably be retired in 30 years. Hell, I could be dead in 30 years. I mean, that's a really long time. But you see, that's not looking at things the right way. The 30 years rule doesn't mean you need to wait 30 years to make an impact. What the 30 years rule means is that the next big thing is usually already 29 years old. We just don't see it. We haven't put the pieces together yet. So to help you understand what that looks like, I want to tell you about a sweet old guy named Charlie Bennett. Now, Charlie, besides being a very sweet old guy, which he is absolutely brilliant. I mean, Charlie is so smart. When you mention his name to a lot of other really, really smart people, their eyes just glaze over because Charlie is truly in a class by himself. Now, when Charlie was growing up, back in the 1950s, he was, at least as he put it to me, he was a geek before geeks were cool. So while all the other kids were running around, playing sports, trading baseball cards, what really inspired Charlie was Watson and Crick's discovery of the structure of DNA. Charlie's a little different. So he goes to college, he majors in biochemistry, and then he goes to Harvard to do his graduate work. And there, being a truly exceptional student, James Watson actually chose him to be his teaching assistant. So Charlie, he ended up spending a lot of time explaining to undergraduates how these long strands of RNA would go migrating out of the nucleus, and they'd meet up with ribosomes and throw off amino acids that create the proteins that build structures and regulate processes in every cell in our bodies. And then one semester, he took an elective course. And that's how, for the very first time, he came in contact with the idea of a Turing machine. Long strings of code that go through a single reader and throw off universal computation. And he said, gee, that really seems a lot like that stuff I'm teaching those kids in Watson's class. He's like, wow, DNA is like some kind of computer. And nature can create computation all by itself. And he just thought that was like the coolest thing ever. So Charlie never became a geneticist. He went to work for IBM as a research scientist. And he did some interesting early work in very theoretical areas like reversible computing and some other things. But his big breakthrough came in 1993 when he led something called the quantum teleportation experiment. Now, this was important for two reasons. First, it helped disprove one of Einstein's final theories, which is pretty good, let's face it. But second, and perhaps even more importantly, it led Charlie just a few months later to write down his 4 laws of quantum information. And I know that must seem terribly abstract. Some might even say useless. But that's what it looks like. That's what it looks like. The next big thing always starts out looking like nothing at all. That's why we miss it. Things that change the world always arrive out of context, for the simple reason that the world hasn't changed yet. So let's bring Charlie's idea into a little bit more focus. This is Jay Gambetta, another obviously much younger scientist at IBM. And he has in his hands there a tablet computer, which is, of course, hundreds of times more powerful than that original Macintosh. And that's because of something called Moore's Law, which has doubled our computing power every 18 months, and it's been going on for 50 years. But that's not what makes this picture interesting. Not the continuity of that tablet computer, but the discontinuity of what it's connected to, which is a quantum computer based on Charlie's ideas that's potentially thousands, if not millions of times more powerful than the technology we have today. And this isn't theoretical. These are real machines. In fact, there's one right behind me. And it's not just IBM either. Lots of companies are working on building quantum computers. Major tech companies like Google, Intel, and Microsoft. Startups like Rigetti, IonQ, and D-Wave. And it's not just computers. There's also companies working on quantum communication, quantum radar, quantum encryption, quantum tools, quantum software. There's a whole ecosystem being built up around quantum technologies. And it's important that we develop these things, because remember, Moore's Law, that comfortable old paradigm that's been driving our technology for the last 50 years, it's coming to an end. If you look at the top of the graph, you can see it's already slowing down. We have maybe 1 or 2 more generations left before it stops altogether. That will happen sometime within the next decade. Think about that. Think about what that means. Our future is not digital. It will be something else. And that's the essence of the new era of innovation I wrote about in my first book, Mapping Innovation. You see, the technologies that drove the 20th century were things like internal combustion, electricity, computers. These are all things that we've come to understand really, really well. So a lot of the value has shifted to the front end, things like design and user experience. But the technologies that will drive the 21st century are going to be different. They're going to be things like synthetic biology, material science, robotics, and AI. Now, those are things that we don't understand very well at all yet. So, while the past 20 or 30 years, we've been learning how to go faster and faster, we're going to have to spend the next decade or so relearning how to go slow again until we figure these things out enough that we can begin to accelerate again. And we're going to have to learn a new technology stack. At the base will be fundamental new technologies, things like quantum computing, neuromorphic computing, and other things. And these will not be digital. They will use a completely different types of logic. We're going to need to develop different computer languages, different algorithmic strategies. The transition will not be seamless. It's going to be hard. One level up, we're going to have new data and analytics. Things like genomics, proteomics, materials genomes. And we're going to need advanced machine learning algorithms in order to make sense of them. At the top will be new applications in the physical world. And that's an important distinction to make. Because even at this late date, information and communication technologies only make up about 6% of GDP in advanced countries. Now, obviously, we can make a lot more impact in the other 94%, in industries like manufacturing, healthcare, and energy. But to do that, we're going to have to change how we innovate. All too often, we look at innovation like this. We put it on an island. We want to focus only on our own internal resources and capabilities because we want innovation to be proprietary, something we can own and control. But innovation is not about what you can own and control. It's about what you can access from partners and vendors and customers and open communities. So it's important we use the entire innovation ecosystem. You know, in the 20th century, competitive advantage was driven by the sum of all efficiencies. If you could become more efficient, you could widen your profit margins. Then you could take those profits and invest it in more resources to maximize your bargaining power across the value chain. And that's how you built sustainable competitive advantage. But in the 21st century, those efficiencies are increasingly being automated. So competitive advantage increasingly depends on the sum of all connections. And your ability to connect to ecosystems of talent, technology, and information increasingly determines how you're going to compete. And that means that we're going to have to reimagine and redesign our organizations. So before I finish up, I want to give you a clear view of what that looks like. This is JCES, the Joint Center for Energy Storage at Argonne National Laboratory. It was set up originally as a collaboration between 5 national labs, 10 research universities, and 5 organizations in the private sector, all working to develop the next generation of advanced battery technologies. They've been able to advance the field much further and much faster than anybody thought was possible. George Crabtree, who's the director of JCES, he told me that, you know, usually discovery propagates at the speed of publication. But here we can operate in the time frame of the next coffee break. Here's what he meant by that. Traditionally, in battery research, what would happen is some researchers would make a discovery in the lab, and then they would work to validate those findings, and then they would prepare a paper for publication, go through peer review, and if everything went really, really well, sometime between 1 and 3 years, their paper would be published in a reputable journal, and quite often, they would find out at that point that their work was completely useless because maybe the materials were too expensive or too difficult to manufacture. Any one of dozens of things that a researcher in the lab would know nothing about, but would be immediately obvious to a manufacturer in private industry. So because JCES puts together those researchers and those manufacturers in private industry, they're able to avoid a lot of those blind alleys and taking a lot of those wrong turns. And that's how they've been able to move the field much further and much faster than anybody thought was possible. And those companies in private industry, they not only get to see ahead of time what the future's going to look like, they actually get to help shape it. If you're in the battery industry and you're not part of JCES, you're at a competitive disadvantage. The manufacturing USA institutes, they're set up the same way. Government labs, research universities, and companies in the private sector, working to advance fields from advanced fabrics to photonics to robotics to composite materials, biofabrication, and on and on and on. IBM's taking a very similar strategy to how they develop quantum computers. They have discovery partners, again, national labs, government labs, research universities, as well as transformation partners. So potential end users, like large banks and manufacturers, as well as startup companies developing quantum software and quantum tools. Think how different that is from how the very same company developed the PC back in 1980, where they sent a group of engineers to Boca Raton to work in secret. I asked Bob Suter, who heads up the quantum efforts at IBM, why such a different approach to quantum computing? And he told me, quantum computing's way too complex. We could never go it alone. We'd never be able to compete if we tried to do it ourselves. And everybody else in the quantum space is taking a similar ecosystem or network-driven approach. That brings me to the final idea I want to leave you with today. In this new era of innovation, collaboration is the new competitive advantage. Because power no longer sits at the top of industrial hierarchies, but emanates from the center of networks and ecosystems.